My boss stood in front of my desk with HR beside him and told me, in a calm, almost pleasant voice, that my position was being restructured and that my cousin Ben would be taking over my team effective immediately. I nodded. I packed a small box of desk items. I said thank you for the opportunity, exactly the way you're supposed to when you're being fired and trying to preserve your dignity. What he didn't know, standing there congratulating himself on making room for his favorite, was that in 6 days, he was going to need my signature to approve his own year-end budget. My name is Sarah. I was 34 years old, and I was about to find out exactly what happens when a man fires the one person in the building who actually owns part of the company he thinks he runs. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who never bothered to ask who you really were, stay with me, because this story is about to get very expensive for him. To understand what happened in that office, you have to go back 9 years, to a moment nobody at that company remembered, because it had nothing to do with any of them. My grandfather Harold started a mid-sized logistics company in the early 90s with 2 partners. One of those partners was Ben's grandfather, which is how our cousin relationship traces back. Distant enough that most people at the company never connected the dots, close enough that family gatherings occasionally overlapped. When my grandfather passed away, his shares in the company were split between his 3 children, one of whom was my mother. My mother, who never had any interest in the logistics industry, quietly transferred a significant portion of her inherited equity to me when I turned 28. Mostly for estate planning and tax reasons our family accountant recommended. At the time, it represented a meaningful but not majority stake, real ownership, real voting rights, but nothing that made me a visible power player in a company with dozens of departments and hundreds of employees. I never advertised this, not out of some strategic secrecy, just because it never felt relevant to my day-to-day job. I wasn't running the company. I was a regional operations manager, hired on my own merit, into a division that had nothing directly to do with the family history behind the business. Most of my coworkers had no idea my last name connected to anything beyond a coincidence. Over the next 6 years, through 2 acquisitions and 1 internal restructuring, my ownership stake grew from that initial inheritance to just under 40% of total company equity, largely because I'd reinvested dividends rather than cashing them out, a decision my accountant recommended, and I never gave much thought to, beyond doing what seemed financially responsible. By the time this story starts, I owned nearly 40% of a company where I also, on paper, worked as a mid-level manager, reporting to a director named Craig. Craig had no idea. Craig had been my direct supervisor for 4 years, and our relationship was, at best, professionally cordial. He was the kind of manager who valued visible loyalty over competence. The people who agreed with him in meetings rose quickly, and the people who occasionally pushed back, even constructively, found themselves quietly sidelined. I fell into the second category, not because I was combative, but because I had a habit of pointing out operational inefficiencies in quarterly reviews. Inefficiencies that, coincidentally, tended to trace back to decisions Craig himself had made. I wasn't trying to embarrass him. I was doing my job. But Craig experienced honest feedback as personal disloyalty, and over 4 years, that dynamic slowly calcified into something closer to resentment. About 8 months before my firing, Craig hired his wife's cousin, Ben, into an entry-level role in my department. I want to be clear that I had no issue with Ben personally at the time. He was pleasant, eager, and reasonably competent for someone new to the industry. My issue, such as it was, emerged slowly as I watched Craig begin grooming Ben for advancement at a pace that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with proximity. Ben was invited to strategy meetings above his pay grade. Ben was given stretch assignments that historically had gone to managers with years more experience. Ben, within 8 months, had somehow accumulated a portfolio of responsibilities that took most people 3 or 4 years to earn. I said nothing about any of this directly to Craig. I simply kept doing my job, managing my team, hitting my numbers, the same way I always had. I assumed, perhaps naively, that competence would eventually speak for itself. And that Craig's clear favoritism toward his wife's family member would resolve itself the way these things sometimes do, through natural attrition or a shift in priorities. Instead, it resolved itself the way it did with me standing at my desk, packing a box, while HR watched. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Craig described my restructuring using language clearly written by HR's legal team, words like organizational realignment and shifting departmental needs, none of which corresponded to anything real. Because my department's workload hadn't changed, my performance reviews had never dipped below exceeds expectations, and the actual restructuring consisted of exactly one change. My position was being eliminated, and Ben was being promoted directly into a newly created role with my exact responsibilities, my exact team, and a Title I level higher than what I'd held. I asked, calmly, why performance wasn't a factor in this decision, given my review history. Craig's answer was vague, something about aligning talent with future company direction. A phrase so meaningless it could have applied to literally any decision made anywhere in the organization. I understood, sitting in that room, exactly what was happening. Craig had been waiting for a justification to remove someone he found personally uncomfortable to manage, and promoting his wife's cousin into my role solved 2 problems for him. Simultaneously, it rewarded family loyalty, and it eliminated an employee who occasionally made him defend his decisions with actual data. What Craig did not know, in that room, is that he was making this decision entirely on his own authority, without realizing that the person he was firing held enough equity in the parent company to sit, if I chose to exercise that right, on decisions well above his own pay grade. I didn't say anything about that in the room. I want to be honest about why. Partly, I was too stunned in the moment to think clearly enough to use it as leverage. But partly, and more importantly, I didn't yet know what I wanted to do with that information. Being fired unfairly is one kind of injury. Deciding how to respond to it, especially when you have real power most people don't know you hold, requires a level of clarity you don't have in the first 11 minutes. So, I packed my box, said thank you, and left. I called my mother that evening, mostly to vent, but also because she was the one who'd transferred me the original equity years earlier, and I wanted to understand, more precisely than I had ever bothered to before, exactly what my ownership actually entitled me to do. She was, understandably, furious on my behalf, but she was also the one who reminded me of something I'd genuinely forgotten in the years since the transfer, that alongside the equity, I'd also inherited a seat, currently unused, on the Shareholder Advisory Committee. A formality my grandfather had built into the original partnership agreement decades earlier to ensure family equity holders retained some structural voice in major company decisions, even if they weren't actively involved in daily operations. I hadn't attended a single advisory committee meeting in 6 years. I'd received the notices, skimmed them, and largely ignored them because I was busy being an operations manager, a job I genuinely enjoyed and had no interest in complicating with family politics. That changed the moment I got fired for a reason that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with nepotism I had personally watched unfold for 8 months. My mother, calmly, suggested I call the company's general counsel directly, not as a disgruntled former employee, but as a shareholder with advisory standing, and ask a very simple, very specific question. Was my termination reviewed or approved by anyone above Craig's direct authority, given that eliminating a position and creating a new one for a family member of the supervising director might reasonably require higher-level sign-off under the company's own internal governance policies? I made that call the next morning. The general counsel, a woman named Patricia Nowak, whom I'd met exactly twice in 6 years at company holiday events, took my call within the hour, once her assistant relayed who I was and what I was asking. I want to be clear about something here, because it matters for understanding what happened next. I wasn't calling to threaten a lawsuit. I wasn't calling to demand my job back out of spite. I was calling because I genuinely wanted to understand whether Craig's decision had followed proper internal process, and because, as a shareholder, I had a legitimate right to ask that question through official channels. Patricia's tone shifted noticeably once she pulled up the org chart and cross-referenced it against the shareholder registry, a document, I later learned, that very few people below the executive level ever had reason to look at closely. She realized, in real time, on that call, that the employee Craig had just terminated for organizational realignment held a 40% equity stake in the parent company, a stake that under the original partnership bylaws entitled me to review rights over any departmental restructuring above a certain budget threshold, specifically because my grandfather had written that provision decades earlier to prevent exactly this kind of unchecked managerial decision-making from happening to family equity holders. Craig's restructuring, it turned out, had never been submitted for that review. He'd processed my termination through standard HR channels, treating it like any other personnel decision, with no idea that company bylaws required a different process entirely when the terminated employee held governance rights at my level. Patricia scheduled an emergency meeting with the CEO, Craig, and myself for the following week. I walked into that conference room 6 days after being fired, and I watched Craig's face when he realized I was sitting at the table not as a former employee being offered a severance negotiation, but as an invited shareholder participant, with Patricia and the CEO, Mr. Halbrook, seated across from him instead of beside him. Mr. Halbrook opened the meeting by stating plainly that he'd only become aware of my equity position that week, and that he was, in his words, deeply concerned that a restructuring decision affecting a shareholder of my standing had bypassed governance review entirely. Craig, to his credit, tried to explain that he had no way of knowing about my ownership stake, which was true and which I didn't dispute. I want to be fair here. Craig's failure wasn't a conspiracy against family shareholders. It was a much simpler failure. He made a personnel decision based on favoritism and personal discomfort with an employee who challenged him, without doing the basic diligence of checking whether that employee held any protected status under company bylaws. But the reason didn't matter as much as the outcome. Mr. Halbrook informed Craig, in that meeting, that the termination was being reversed pending a full governance review, and that Ben's promotion, having been built entirely on top of an improperly processed restructuring, was being paused indefinitely until the review concluded. Craig asked, visibly rattled, what this meant for his own position. Mr. Halbrook didn't answer that question directly in the meeting. He simply said the board would be conducting a broader review of departmental hiring practices, given what this situation had revealed. I sat through all of it without saying much. I didn't need to. The bylaws my grandfather wrote decades earlier were doing the talking for me. Over the following 2 months, the governance review Mr. Halbrook ordered expanded well beyond my individual case. Investigators looking into Craig's restructuring decision found a pattern: 3 other employees in his department, over the preceding 2 years, had been quietly pushed out under similarly vague realignment language, each time coinciding with a promotion for someone with a personal connection to Craig. Craig was terminated 4 months after my own firing, this time for cause, following the review's conclusion that his departmental decisions had repeatedly violated both company policy and, in my specific case, formal governance bylaws. Ben, to his credit, handled the situation with more grace than I expected. He reached out to me directly once the review became public within the company, acknowledging that he hadn't known the full context of how his promotion had been engineered, and that he felt uncomfortable benefiting from a process that turned out to be improper. He voluntarily stepped back from the elevated role Craig had created for him, returning to a position closer to what his actual experience warranted, and asked if we could talk honestly, as cousins, about what had happened. I appreciated that more than I expected to. As for me, I was reinstated with back pay, though I want to be honest that I didn't return to my old role. Mr. Halbrook, in the same meeting where my termination was reversed, asked whether I'd be interested in a newly created position on the governance and internal audit team, given that I had, in his words, apparently been sitting on relevant standing this whole time, without anyone realizing it, including yourself. I said yes. It felt like the right next step, not out of ambition, but because I'd just watched, firsthand, how easily a company could be run by favoritism when the people with actual oversight authority weren't paying attention. I didn't want to be that kind of quiet, disengaged shareholder anymore. It's been a year since Craig stood at my desk and told me my position was being restructured. I think about that 11-minute meeting often, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of clarity about what it actually revealed. Craig didn't fire me because he researched who I was and decided the risk was worth it. He fired me because he never bothered to find out who I was at all. He saw a manager who occasionally disagreed with him in meetings, and a wife's cousin eager to move up, and he made a decision entirely based on convenience and comfort, never once considering that the org chart in front of him didn't tell the whole story of who actually held power in that building. I've thought a lot about what would have happened if I hadn't called my mother that night, if I hadn't remembered or bothered to ask about the advisory committee seat I'd ignored for 6 years. I think about how many people, in situations exactly like mine, have more standing, more leverage, more protection than they realize, simply because nobody ever bothered to explain to them what their own family history actually entitled them to. My relationship with Ben has actually improved since all of this happened. Strangely enough. We talk now, honestly, in a way we never did when he was busy being fast-tracked past people with more experience. My relationship with the company itself is different too. I sit in board-adjacent meetings now, asking the kinds of questions Craig never expected anyone below the executive level to ask. Craig, as far as I know, has not found similar employment at a comparable level since his termination. I don't take satisfaction in that exactly. I take satisfaction in the fact that a governance structure my grandfather built decades ago, quietly, almost as an afterthought, ended up protecting exactly the kind of person it was designed to protect: someone who did their job well, got pushed out for the wrong reasons, and had, without ever asking for it, the standing to make sure that couldn't happen quietly. Craig thought he was firing a mid-level manager who occasionally made his life inconvenient in quarterly reviews. He didn't know he needed my signature to keep his own job safe, and by the time he found out, it was already too late for him to do anything about it. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who never bothered to find out who you really were, Let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling a lot of you have quietly held more power than the people around you ever gave you credit for. Subscribe for more stories like this one, because next week I'm telling you about the mother-in-law who thought she controlled everything in her son's marriage, until she found out whose name was actually on the deed to her own house.